Hello and welcome to Future Proof Farming, a three-part series on the Integrity 365 Financial Insights podcast aimed at farmers and landowners. I'm Esther.
And I'm Nicola. In this episode, we talk about legal essentials for farmers, trusts, power of attorneys, and legal agreements. Claire Speed joins us from Hedges Law. Hello, and welcome to Integrity 365's Financial Insights podcast. I'm Nicola.
And I'm Esther.
And today we're joined by Claire from Hedges Law. Welcome, Claire.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So today we are covering future-proof farming, legal essentials for farmers. Claire, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you do with your clients and about your company?
Of course. So I head up the dispute and rural team at Hedges Law. I deal with all types of civil litigation cases, but also we deal with dispute management and the mitigation of disputes.
Very interesting. So you see the good, the bad, and the ugly.
We do. We see all sorts.
So there's been a lot of change recently from the autumn budget in the end of 2024, where inheritance tax might now apply to more farmers than it did previously. And as such, succession planning is even more important.
So, Clem, what do you think are the key legal considerations that farming families should be addressing early on?
I think farmers need to look at their long-term plans and the consideration of the individuals working in the farm. That could be employees, it could be family members. And I think off the back of that, they need to consider what the future looks like in terms of the future of the farm and how it's set up, so as to ensure that succession runs smoothly.
Mm-hmm. Sure. And so what's a good starting point for starting those conversations?
I think you look at sort of have an open conversation within the family to see who wants to run the farm and who perhaps doesn't. And then off the back of that, you plan for the future.
I can imagine you meet with quite a lot of family members and business members during that then.
Yes, we do. And you look at the structure of the farm, you look at the farming assets, you look at whether there are any business assets and how it's set up. And you look at those who perhaps don't want to be involved in the future of the farm. And those that do want to be involved in the future of the farm, it's important to make sure that you put all the wheels and motions in place to make sure everybody's interest is protected. And you also have to look at planning in terms of making the most of the inheritance tax allowances. And any other allowances that could apply to the farming business.
And on that theme, how would you say that wills, lasting power of attorneys, and sort of probate will fit into an effective succession planning?
So wills are really important. Without a will, your estate will be dealt with the rules of intestacy, which will mean that your assets could be distributed to someone who perhaps doesn't have an interest in the farm, so therefore by default would acquire an interest. To have a will also make sure that you are making the most of your inheritance tax reliefs. So a will is really important to make sure that your wishes are actioned upon death, essentially. In terms of lasting powers of attorneys, they are just as important, and in some circumstances are more important for business continuity purposes, for the reason that, for example, we all know that farming is a very dangerous occupation, if not one of the most dangerous. You could have an accident, you could be incapacitated for whatever reason, which could mean that without a lasting power of attorney, you wouldn't have any business continuity, and business could be disruptive, for example, access to bank accounts and things like that.
Okay.
And what sort of age or stage of life would you recommend people put those lasting powers of attorney into place?
I would say that it's important from an early age. Whoever is involved in the farming business should be protected by a lasting power of attorney, so that business continuity is protected.
Okay. And you mentioned about the wills being really important in regard to inheritance tax planning. Are you able to tell us a little bit more about how that works?
So a carefully drafted will make sure that you are making the most of all of your inheritance tax reliefs and allowances.
Great, thanks, Claire. So we've talked a little bit about wills and powers of attorney. Alongside that, I mean, farming businesses can often span for multiple generations and involve multiple family members. So, how could the use of prenuptial and postnuptial agreements potentially be involved in that succession planning, alongside also sort of partnership and shareholder agreements?
Okay. So, in terms of protecting the farm and the farming assets, it's important that a partnership agreement is put into place. The partnership agreement will set out how partners can be appointed, and also how they can be dismissed or removed. Without a partnership agreement, if one of the partners dies, then the partnership essentially ceases. So it's important to have a partnership agreement in place, essentially. That will help protect the farm and its assets. With regard to marriage, pre-nuptial and post-nuptial agreements are also a useful tool of protecting farming assets. Approximately 42% of marriages end in divorce, and the starting point for the courts is to look at the marriage assets and divide those equally. And they can be persuaded to deviate from equality, but they have to have good reason. So to protect the farm by a prenuptial or postnuptial agreement is quite important. And the partnership agreement will also have a similar mechanism if it's well drafted in terms of separation and divorces as well. In respect of relationship breakdowns, the farm can often be set up in a way that is run as a business. There could be employees. Other family members will have interests in the farm. So by its complex nature, it is important to make sure that a carefully worded partnership agreement or a prenup or postnuptial agreement is in force, as that will help protect the assets.
And could you give a couple of brief examples of the kind of provisions that you might put into one of those nuptial agreements, just so people can understand more how they're used?
So the use of prenup and postnuptial agreements are quite common in farming families, and you will see clauses which will be specific in relation to the individual and the farm itself. So you may see a clause in there, for example, which will deal with farming assets or farming property. By the very nature of a farming business or farming partnership, it's important that the agreements are relevant to the individual circumstances and needs of the farm. So you may see clauses in there which will deal with specific property, perhaps, or you may see clauses in there which would deal with a separation and what happens to different assets within the business.
Let's take the example of a husband and wife, and in the circumstance that her family is the traditional farming family and they were to go through a divorce. Would it have something in there such as perhaps maybe there's a property that the family lives in, and then the rest of the assets are farming assets? Would the agreement perhaps specify something like the farming asset specifically would pass down the female side, and maybe the marital home split equally or perhaps solely to the husband in that circumstance?
The agreements itself can be drafted in a way that can protect particular interests. There is some question as to whether they are binding, but generally the courts will take them into consideration. So they can be drafted in a way that the needs of an individual party can be protected, but you have to make sure it's not too biased against one of the parties in the event there's a challenge in the future.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, you have to be so careful. And also, I should perhaps say, it's important that when you actually embark upon one of those agreements, whether it be postnup or a prenuptial agreement, that the other party takes independent legal advice, which always assists if there is a challenge at a later stage.
And am I right in thinking that postnup should be reviewed every few years, or is it more of a set and forget agreement?
So yes, they can be reviewed. It's the same as partnership agreements. You always have to make sure that they are up to date and that they're actually relevant. And there can be a change in circumstance of an individual.
Okay. So Claire, I'm sure you've seen some really difficult case studies over your working life. Could you tell us about one where perhaps you've met a family and haven't had any of the legal essentials in place?
Of course. So one springs to mind, and that was a farming family, an elderly farmer in his late 80s, farming the family farm with his son, and they didn't have any wills in place or any partnership agreement.
Okay.
We discussed with the farming family their needs in terms of protecting their assets and the business. The first recommendation was that they draft wills so that their assets were left in accordance with the terms of their will rather than distributed by way of the rules of intestacy. Also, they would be making the most of their inheritance tax allowances and reliefs as well. Another point that we recommended was entering into and drafting a partnership agreement, which set out the terms of the family business, identified all of the assets which belong to the partnership so that they can make the most of the relevant allowances, and protected them for business continuity purposes should there be a death or, for example, a retirement.
Okay, brilliant.
In addition to that, finally, we looked at both parties entering into lasting power of attorney. Again, to protect them in the event that one party lost capacity, so that there could be business continuity and they could put the farm into trusted hands by their appointed attorneys.
And given the big changes that have occurred in the last budget, obviously one of those key principles is the use of full inheritance tax relief on the first million of agricultural or business property related assets. So would this structure help to secure that 1 million on first or second death? How would that tend to work?
So in that regard, it would really depend on the circumstances of how the individuals were leaving their assets, what assets were held by the farming partnership, and the will would deal with the maximisation and mitigation of inheritance tax and making full use of the allowances that are in place at the current time for both parties.
Yeah, I think also just sort of thinking about that case study you've put that is it's quite a typical circumstance that we come across in farming families. You have the more elderly generation continuing to farm, haven't passed it on fully to the next generation. It kind of made me think, is there a point at which you think it's too late to start doing any succession planning? Obviously, earlier is always better, but is there always something that can be done even at a later stage in someone's life?
For sure, definitely. And I think it's important at any stage that in the scenario whereby there is no protection in place by way of a partnership agreement, a lasting power of attorney, or a will, provided those individuals are able and have the capacity to make those decisions, it's important that any stage in life that if in the absence of that planning, that they take steps to plan.
Sure. So we've talked about partnership agreements. It'd be really interesting now to cover perhaps some of the benefits and pitfalls of transfers between spouses.
Okay, so you can transfer your legal and beneficial interests in property to a spouse, and that in itself could mean that you benefit from certain tax reliefs, but also it does have pitfalls. For example, you then lose control of that particular asset, and you're in the hands of third parties at that point. That then could mean that there is business interruption, for example, and it could stop business continuity if you are in the hands of a third party who and you have a lack of control over that asset or particular part of the farm.
So I suppose you're referring there in relation to potential divorce, if you were to transfer assets and then things go wrong from there?
Yes. So it could mean that if you were to separate, that certain assets would no longer be in your name, and that could have a detrimental impact on any financial settlement related to a divorce.
Sure. So, something that Nicola and I often see when we're planning with farming clients is you have an older generation who have farmed for many years and want to continue farming until the end of their days, effectively. And then they've got a younger generation coming through who are perhaps taking on more of the bulk of the work at this stage. And they want to think about that succession planning, transfer of assets through to that younger generation, while still having some involvement with the farm. Now, obviously, one of the traps that they can fall into there is the gifts with reservation rules, where they give something away but continue to benefit from it. So, how could people potentially look at that from a legal planning perspective in order to mitigate that risk?
In terms of that scenario, it's something that we too see quite commonly in terms of people wanting to farm until, as you say, the end of their days, but then you have the younger generation coming through. Our advice piece to those farmers is to start your succession planning now. Have an open conversation with your family and family members who want to be part of the farm. Sit down, discuss your vision for the future with the farm, and make sure then that you have the appropriate partnership agreement drafted and set into place, which has everybody's expectations aligned. And then also, you would need to link that closely with advice from your accountant to make sure that each generation is making the most of tax reliefs and any benefits that could also apply when they are looking at that succession planning piece.
So, it is possible for someone to stay on the farm and stay involved with the farm and pass the farming assets down to a younger generation. It just requires a little bit more forward planning.
It does. And planning is key, basically, because by its very nature, a farm business is quite complicated. You've got various differing interests. You may have businesses or parcels of land in different individuals' names. So it's important to get to grips with actually what the farming partnership may own, what they own as individuals, and make sure everybody's expectations are aligned, and then ensure that your partnership agreement is drafted to reflect that.
Do you tend to see quite a gradual change in ownership over time with your clients? So will you tend to see perhaps a certain percentage pass to the next generation? You see that same client several years later and more is passed down. What do you tend to see with your clients?
We see any scenario really in terms of it really does depend on the specific circumstances of the farm, what it farms, whether there are diversification projects, commercial aspects of the farm. So it really does depend on the individual circumstances. But we are seeing it more now with the budget changes that will come into force next year. We are seeing more of a focus from farmers to think about those aspects than perhaps they have done in the past.
So, Claire, in respect to passing assets down to the next generation, what have you found in the past that can sometimes prevent that occurring successfully?
I think you have to firstly consider whether that generation wants the assets passed down. If they're reluctant, then again, open communications within the family are important, but also you have to consider whether there is any lending on the land or property, and you have to look at the lender's requirements, as that may prevent transferring assets. That's something that I would recommend checking.
That's a really useful point, because actually, as you say, a lot of the time there is a significant lending on a farm on various aspects, and that can also affect how the tax treatment is calculated as well. So thank you for that. And how would you say that trusts come into this planning arrangement? What are the benefits of using trusts perhaps to pass down part of the farm to the next generation? How could that perhaps help with some of these aforementioned reliefs?
Trusts are a good tool to protect farming assets. There are different types of trusts, and the type of trust that perhaps a particular individual or individuals would want to enter into depends really on the complexity of the circumstances, and also whether there are minors that need to be represented within the trust structure. So the type of trust does differ from scenario to scenario, but trusts are a good way of protecting farming assets. And they set out how the trust will work in the future and how that would interact with the farm.
So Claire, in what scenario would a trust be a useful tool in succession planning with families, and perhaps in the other end, where may it not be appropriate?
I think that any farming family that are considering and contemplating their succession planning should consider the use of trusts. In some scenarios, it won't be appropriate, and the protection of the assets can be dealt with by way of a partnership agreement. But in the circumstances where trusts are quite effective is where there are multiple generations of families, and the use of a trust is something that would probably be highly considered.
Great. So we've covered a lot of ground, Claire. Thank you for all of your insights. I just want to sort of round things off for people. If you could give one final piece of advice to those farming families who are looking to start maybe their succession planning for the first time, what would that be?
My advice would be, if you haven't thought about it, think about it. And again, it goes to the communication piece. Sit down with the family, discuss who wants to do what the farming vision is for the family, and ensure that everybody's expectations are aligned. Then you can start to plan and make sure that you make the full use of any allowances available to you.
Brilliant. And what would it look like perhaps if someone doesn't plan? Have you got a case study you've seen where someone hasn't had the right tools?
Yes, and one springs to mind, and that involves, again, a farming family, and on death, neither of the farmers who were running the farm had wills or lasting powers of attorney. What that meant on death was that the individuals who inherited under the rules of intestacy couldn't access bank accounts, and ultimately that prevented them from being able to fund the farm to the extent that they couldn't feed their cows, essentially. When you are going through the intestacy rules, it takes a long time to get your letters of administration from the probate registry. So these individuals were left with no other choice but to pool their own resources to pay for fodder and feed the cows in the interim. So that's a really important piece, really, because that's fundamental to the farm, and it's running.
And I think that's a big misconception, isn't it, that they can probably access mum or dad's account in this interim phase to pay whatever needs to be paid. Actually, in your experience, you see where that doesn't occur. And my understanding is actually the bank is sort of locked in and frozen those assets. So there is no access once that death has occurred. They are stuck. What timeline are we talking about for that sort of case? Is it sort of a year or so before they can access those assets?
It can be up to 9 to 12 months to get your letters of administration, which essentially is your legal right to administer the estate. So clearly that is a long time in the yearly cycle of a farm, and many things could happen during that time, harvest, etc. But all of that time, the individuals are left to fund the farm from their own resources, which invariably is quite difficult.
Really difficult.
Thank you so much, Claire, for all of your insight and contribution today. It's been really interesting for us and definitely for the audience who are going to be watching this back as well. So we've rounded up our first episode of the Future Proof Farming series. We do have 2 more coming. The second episode looks at protecting the farm using life insurance, and the third episode looks at growth beyond the farm using investments and tax-efficient investment planning. Thanks so much to Claire today from Hedges Law. We'll
Thank
link their website in the podcast notes, so you can get in touch with them for any of your legal queries around what we've talked about today. You can find ourselves at financialadviceforfarmers.co.uk. We'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.